Hi, everyone. Welcome to Creative Convos. It's a monthly kind of Catholic show, usually with our podcast guests or new guests sometimes, to talk about genres and just things that are going on in the community, but mostly genres because it's just fun to talk about how Catholic authors can maybe approach or think about writing different kinds of novels. So welcome to Elizabeth, guest from a recent podcast, and Mary Woods, who hopefully will come back on in the future. She's got an upcoming sci-fi novel. So welcome, ladies. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So today's all about talking about science fiction, sci-fi. Everybody here is a long-time sci-fi fan. And actually, let's just start there for a minute. Like, what are some of your fandoms? And if you were a character from a sci-fi story, series, movie, who would you pick? Elizabeth, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. So growing up, my dad was always into Star Trek, so we grew up with a lot of Star Trek in the household. And then my brother got super into Star Wars. There was a lot of Star Wars, and I pretended to hate it because he loved it. So a lot of science fiction, and the one that I really brought into the family was Doctor Who. So I was thinking about it, and if I were a character, I think I would actually be the TARDIS, because there is an episode where the TARDIS becomes a human for a day. I don't remember how it happened, but it's just a fun episode. I love making those, they always treat the TARDIS as a character, but kind of an object into humanizing it. So that's just some of my background, that the science fiction I grew up with that really formed me today.
That's cool. Mary, who would you be?
Well, you almost, but not quite stole mine, Elizabeth. Because the first place my mind went was Doctor Who as well, but I think I might just be one of the companions. It would be perilous, but it would be fun.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm curious if there was and I know I kind of sprang this question on you right before the call, but I don't watch enough Doctor Who to get my, Doctor Who card. So that's the one kind of fandom I don't know much about. Can you, for those who also don't know too much about it, who are the companions, and was there a particular one that you like most?
So basically in the show, the companions are, basically just, they're usually other human characters. I think like in the old classic Doctor Who, there are some non-human companions, but I haven't seen very much of that, so I don't know them. But they're like usually other, they're humans who are traveling with the Doctor, who's an alien time traveler in his time machine. So, yeah, they're usually just like, these people who sort of get caught up in his adventures in one way or another, and, end up just forming this really sort of close friendship and
bond,
camaraderie.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun, yeah.
Oh, that's
Get
cool.
into a lot of trouble,
I've only
too.
seen a couple with
They get into a lot of trouble, too.
I would imagine, like, how many seasons are there? That's like, I don't know. It's like, isn't it one of the longest running sci-fi series or something? Maybe apart from Star Trek?
Yeah, counting the original classic stuff that started in, the 1960s or something?
70s? 60s?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Over 50 years, so.
Dang.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the canon or the retconning that probably goes on.
Oh, there's a lot. But it's time travel, so you can conveniently, like, sort of just overwrite things if you need to.
That's true. Well, my childhood was Stargate. So I loved that portal fantasy, portal sci-fi fiction. I love that. Very Narnia in that sense. So if I was a character, I'd be Daniel Jackson. And if those who haven't seen Stargate, or you aren't gateheads like me, he is the archaeologist dork. Hold on, I'm actually trying to remember. Dork, geek, or nerd? I think he's the geek. And his whole thing is deeply, deeply passionate, not just about research, but about people, and more interested in context over the mission of just getting something done. So that kind of thing of, dorking about the details and wanting to understand what the writing says, and just getting mad when Colonel Carter gets shut down and she's not able to actually give the correct definitions of things, and And Jack O'Neill is like, hey, we're in second grade here. Dumb it down for the viewers. And then she goes, okay, well, think of a donut in a laser machine, you know. And he's like, got it. So Daniel Jackson, I think, I love that guy. Cool. So today we're talking about sci-fi. And I was curious to just kind of bring us on and just talk around it, partly as Catholic authors, you know, but more interested in like how being Catholic maybe inspires us to think about this genre, right? So we'll give the definition of the whole thing in a moment. Before doing that, I'm curious to have us share a little bit of our backstories and some of the stuff that we've been working on. Mary, like I said, you've got a novel coming out. I want to hear about that. Elizabeth, you actually work at a space debris corporation, conglomerate, syndicate
company,
thingy?
Yeah.
Company, yeah. Let's start there. Quick bios and writing experience. What are some things you've written?
Who do you want to start?
Yeah, Elizabeth, why don't you go first?
Okay, yeah. So my background is that I grew up homeschooled, and sometimes my assignments were writing, you know, go enter the Reading Rainbow contest as homework. And along the way, I discovered I love writing. And I actually did start writing some science fiction short stories for like the 4-H fair, I think was a big one. I did a series like every year. I wrote a science fiction fairy tale and always talked about writing a science fiction novel with my brother, which never happened yet. I guess it hasn't happened yet. So I ended up going to school for writing and communications, and I've self-published 2 Bible story picture books, The Hungry Kitten's Tale and Willie and the Good Shepherd. Continue to write. I've got a couple more picture books in the works right now, coming out either in the fall or in the spring. But that's all what I do for fun. That's my, author by night, and by day, I'm communications coordinator for an orbital debris research and solution development company. I always got to get the tagline right. So we go and we have a satellite that is going to match the rotation of a piece of orbital debris after tracking it. And then using our tentacle-like arms, we're going to catch the debris, and then we're going to take it to recycling facilities in space to be used for other in-space materials. So,
well, hold on. There are we have recycling thingies in space now.
We will. They're in the process of doing it right now. There's a lot of companies that we're working with, and yeah.
Wow.
So,
Planet Earth got cooler.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. All the things that humans can come up with and actually make happen. It's great. It's great to see it.
Man, that's awesome. Have you thought about writing any sci-fi of your own further down the line?
Further down the line, for sure, especially working with Calmore Sync, that's the name of the company. There's just so much out there that we could do. So many little nuances to explore, especially as I actually just wrote a draft of an article that will go up on our website about how orbital debris is portrayed in WALL-E, Gravity, and Space Sweepers, which is a more recent movie about orbital debris. But to see what they got right, what they got wrong, and, they came out, WALL-E was like 2003, 2008. Gravity was 2013, Space Sweepers, which is now how what they portrayed is actually what has happened since then and what could happen. So yeah, that gives me a lot of ideas. Like, well, that was wrong then, but I could write a story about how it is now, but then it'll be wrong in 5 years. But so yeah, there's a lot of story ideas there to just really delve into. So
that is fun. And actually, I remember the show that I was trying to remember when we were last chatting. And I think there's only one season that came out in 2021. It was called Debris by Universal. I think it was trying to be a new X-Files, maybe.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that was fun. So thank you for all that. Mary, how about you? What's your origin story, and what are you allowed to reveal about your upcoming novel?
So fellow homeschooler here. And yeah, I was just raised reading a lot. I loved sort of adventure stories from a very early age, and I started writing my own stories for fun from a pretty young age. And now that I think of it, even though for most of my childhood and sort of teenage years, I considered myself mostly a fantasy writer, when I think back to the beginning, my very first story that I wrote when I was like 7 years old was technically sci-fi because it was about my favorite stuffed animal dog building a spaceship and going to the moon. So, and I like still have that. So it's like, oh, I guess it all started there. But yeah, as I just mentioned, I didn't actually read or write a ton of sci-fi until sort of my like late high school, getting into college. I mean, like I grew up watching Star Wars and some of the just sort of popular culture things, but wasn't super into it until college. Some of my siblings started getting me into Doctor Who, so that was kind of a big turning point. And then as far as the writing sci-fi goes, it's a little bit of a funny story because I was in college and had several of my close friends were part of a tabletop role-playing game that had a sci-fi setting. So it wasn't like the typical Dungeons and Dragons setting. It was, a setting that the game master had come up with himself. And so it was sort of sci-fi fantasy, kind of in the vein of Star Wars, that sort of thing. And so I ended up joining that group and playing that game and just really enjoying it. And then I started just writing stories for fun in that world. And, kept doing that even after college. Just kept corresponding with those friends and doing the, sort of trading the lore and creating new trivia and stuff. And then one day I found myself writing on this sort of whim of a story idea that just took off. And eventually, about 3-ish years later at this point, is now my forthcoming novel, Markmaker, that's coming out from Prism later this year. So...
Can you give us a thumbnail of Markmaker?
So basically the setting is... it's set in this alien culture that they're kind of like this almost nomadic. They live on these giant generation ships, like these city ships that have been wandering throughout space for centuries. And their culture and sort of society and like even religion sort of revolves around these ceremonial tattoos that everyone gets, for various important life events, for your birth and your ancestry and, marriage and accomplishments. And also things like crimes, if you're a criminal, that you get marked for that. So that's like the setting, and then the story itself is about one of the tattoo artists. So obviously they're kind of these very important figures in this culture. And he finds himself for sort of like, different political pressures and conflicts that are going on. He finds himself forced to give a mark of banishment to a man that he knows is innocent, like who hasn't committed the crime he's been accused of. But he's forced to give this mark, and now he realizes like, oh, I've broken my oath to mark the truth. So then he kind of has to decide what he's going to do about that and how he's going to redeem himself, but also, try and navigate this very dangerous political situation. So that's the thumbnail. But it's been a ton of fun, and
that is awesome.
Super, super excited about it.
So when does it come out?
We don't have...
As of this recording.
As of this recording, we don't quite have a set release date yet, but later this year, hopefully sometime in the fall. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, cool. Very cool. Well, why don't we dig into the talking about... Well, actually, I should probably share a little bit of my own. this sounds like Revenge of the Homeschoolers here.
Yes.
Return of the Homeschoolers. I was in and out of homeschooling as well, and schools and so on. But a consummate dork throughout the whole thing. I had the massive aviator glasses. Always had black eyes, big teeth. Until my head grew into them. Now I've got a big head. Owning the pun. Loving creating. I remember reading Doctor Who novels in the small school library that we had, and then fell into discovering and loving some writers like what's his name, John Wyndham or Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and loving that kind of sort of deep thinking fantasy that I think birthed a lot of the fantasy sci-fi, I should say, that a lot of sci-fi today kind of comes out of. There are some movies today, like maybe Arrival, right? That's it goes a little deeper and it's not as flashy and it's trying to really get you to think about something, So as fun as Star Wars is, I really love the stuff that gets you to actually think a bit more, stuff that's got a little more meat to it. And one of the things that I loved about Stargate was all of the mythology that's kind of in there. I loved mythology, and reading all of that growing up. So some of my first stories were actually very deeply sci-fi, even before I kind of got into the fantasy. And I remember it was all about lightsabers and dinosaurs and planes crashing and people having to fight their way out of packs of tyrannosaurs and stuff like that. And it was a mess, but it was fun, and I loved that. Love that creativity. So I'm curious to ask you, what is it that you love about sci-fi as a genre, right? Because it's different to fantasy, right? It's got different themes. It's trying to do something a bit different, but in effect, it's still a form of fantasy. And I actually think it goes all the way back to is it the 12th century? I saw a YouTube thumbnail today that was like, look at this ancient sci-fi kind of story. And the thing that I get about science fiction, even when you go back to the Middle Ages, and maybe you could say it's their version of fantasy, but for them when they were writing it, they thought this stuff was real. You travel far enough, you're going to get out to what today is Ethiopia. And there's people with faces in their stomachs and single feet and dog bodies and trippy stuff. But for them, a lot of them, they weren't actually sure that it wasn't true. They thought it actually was, and they were kind of blending with the rules of the universe that they lived in to kind of share something or say something. And I think that's kind of the thing about sci-fi as opposed to fantasy. Sci-fi is we're going to pretend that this is happening more in the real world. It's fantasy is intending to be, I don't know, in an alternate universe, alternate world. A lot of sci-fi is too. And there's kind of the challenge, which is why I want to kind of ask you ladies what you think too. How do you define sci-fi versus fantasy? And here's my thought, and I'm curious what you think. I think that the definition of science fiction could be, it's all about a frontier, and it's all about contact with an idea, or contact with a reality, or with perhaps the supernatural, or we could sort of blanket that under the numinous. It doesn't have to be good. It could be neutral. It could be bad. It could be a sentient galaxy. The point is, it's something beyond our normal, but it starts with kind of how we feel about being normal, coming into contact with stuff that is not normal or is other. It could be holy. It could be evil. It could be fantasy coming in, sci-fi coming in contact with fantasy, And in that way, I feel like sci-fi is it's kind of like a dream or an imagination that a materialist person, a scientific-minded culture has about coming into contact with a reality greater than what we say is normal. What do you think about that? Mary, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking as I was kind of reflecting on the question before this, that I've often had the thought that sci-fi seems to fill the role for us, for the modern culture, that sort of fantasy or fairy tales did for older cultures. In the specific, not in every way, but in the specific way of if it's sort of yeah, it's that frontier, it's that unknown, for us, because we've sort of in this modern age where we've explored most of the earth. So like you were saying, we don't have this concept now of like, oh, across the ocean there are, strange creatures and the world works in strange ways. For us, it's like outer space now, right? Like that's the great unknown. That's where things can happen that you've never seen or imagined before. So it does seem to be like a way for us to encounter wonder, but it's almost more relatable, I think, for modern people, because it is a little more set in the in like material, sort of science based, oh, this is like, this is really out there. Not to discredit, the importance of like fantasy and the numinous at all, but I think there's something about, yeah, just the way that we are now with like, sort of exploration and sort of the scientific method, just like that. Sorry, I don't know if that's making any sense, but
No, but I think that's exactly it, right? It's the name of the genre, sci-fi, and I think a lot of publishers just sort of lump it with fantasy together because it's kind of doing the same thing, but it's very distinct in that it is. I think Star Wars is a great example of a materialist culture. Physics is it. What you see is what you get. Breaking up against its own boundaries and coming into contact with, well, in Star Wars' case, a greater religious reality, and then either denying it. Han Solo, I think, is kind of, and maybe Luke Skywalker, but Han Solo, I think, is really like meant to be us, sort of the average normal person who's like, this is what reality is, and then I'm watching my new contacts and friends just throw themselves into this religious reality and truth, and then slowly kind of make fun of it and sort of get into it all. Elizabeth, what do you think about how to define science fiction?
So the way I've always thought about it, so again, I kind of considered myself a fantasy writer, and then I looked back at my history and I'm like, well, no, that first story I wrote for 4-H was actually about, I think I called it Space Girls. It was literally, science fiction. But that science fiction is almost, and then fantasy, like a Venn diagram, where science fiction is mostly within fantasy, but sometimes completely a little bit out, where it's like, I'd almost rather consider it science fantasy rather than science fiction, because it does seem to have the component of science, which then in a fantasy novel, I'm sure there's a science to their magic, but it's not our science. Whereas you go to science fiction and Star Trek, you're like, yeah, their communicators make total sense. And now, what they had in the 60s, look what we have today. And kind of how many people were inspired by Star Trek to go into careers and are now NASA scientists or have become astronauts. So it's what's the difference between magic and science, really? And I think that's a differentiator is, how much science is there in your magic? Because I know some engineer friends who love a good fantasy story when there's a logic to the magic, but that's not necessarily science like we have science.
Right.
So I think that's the squishy area that's fun to play with, for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of science fiction is full of hand waving. I think it's called in. And feel free to anybody jump in at any point. But there's a lot of sci-fi that's, I think it serves the same function as a lot of fantasy. Like, we need to redefine barriers. Like, as Catholics, the world that we live in is very different to our atheist friends or agnostic friends. Like, it is a very sacramental worldview. It's like, it's not theirs, it's theirs plus more. It includes more. We've still got the physics and the quantum mechanics and measurement and the scientific method and so on, but we've also maybe got stuff like, and don't hold me to this, but like, magic and alchemy and sacramental thinking and all of that. It's also, and it does depend on how you define it, but that's also part of this. There are angels alongside earth diggers and bridges, so, but it's that extra kind of level, I guess you could call it like magic or mystery, mysticism stuff, I see a lot of sci-fi is like coming into contact with that. And I think the people who write science fiction that's really trying to contribute something to culture or actually go a little deeper. I mean, you can have just fun with laser swords and because I think lightsabers is copyright, and guns and just galactic battles and space operas, and that's not trying to be deep. It's just trying to have fun, and there's a place for that. But then if you are trying to go a little deeper, then you're starting to, what you're doing is like you're dramatizing philosophy maybe. You're asking a bigger or a deeper question, or you're trying to understand where does the edge of my understanding of what reality is come into contact with something greater. I think the new series, what is it? Star Trek Discovery. Mm-hmm. I think it stays firmly in a materialist kind of quantum world, but it's got a cool thing where it's true to that sort of tradition of like a little bit of mind expanding drama, where they discover the mycelial network that underlies the universe, and they can tap into it and jump into anywhere. And humans are like biologically evolved to actually be able to resonate with it. And 20 years ago in Star Trek canon, Star Trek universe, that was not a thing, and all of a sudden now it can be. It's that kind of that frontier stuff. I mean, it's consummate Star Trek, obviously, but I think that intrigues me, and I think that's what I love about science fiction. You get that with John Wyndham, or one of my favorite novels growing up, and I want to throw this over to you both in a minute. Favorite novels growing up was Time Machine by H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds. I can't say how many times I read those over and over again. There's just something about that sense of discovery and that sense of challenging our own viewpoints. Are we sure we got it all together? And that's kind of the point of other things kind of intruding in. And I think science is in that kind of position today, and our culture is in that position today. As we not only come in contact with other cultures, we now can't run away from them anymore. Like, not that we would ever want to, but we can't avoid that. And there's like that interblending, and now we have to learn from each other. And then the weird things that happen when that does, because cultures think about things differently. And Arrival, that movie, is such a great case in point of one culture coming into contact with another culture, and then recognizing, because you think or you interact with your language differently, you interact with reality differently. And when I engage or integrate with that, then I start to change. And I think that it's a dramatized story. I think it's radically true when you go and you enter into how other cultures, or when atheists, for example, or heck, even when we Catholics engage with our own religious tradition and truth more seriously, we change. And then we start to look at the mystics and the saints, and we're like, oh, now I begin to see why you were kind of out there and weird and different. You actually were on a bit of a different wavelength. There's more of reality in you, Curious, what is it that you love, about fantasy, about science fiction as a genre? Elizabeth, would you like to go?
Yeah, what I love about science fiction as a genre, I think it's fantasy that seems almost more achievable. Again, going back to Star Trek, discovering these strange new worlds. Well, we have robots on Mars. We're working to actively get humans to Mars. We're actually going to go there. And that's the start of a lot of science fiction novels, is you're going to a different planet. But also, there's a lot of science fiction just set it going into the depths of the sea. Or I think this was also Isaac Asimov, The Lost World, and going and finding dinosaurs and kind of the other cultures there, like the cultures of the dinosaurs. I'm not sure they saw other humans, but it's
Wait, wasn't that was that Jules Verne? Or
yes,
Conan Doyle?
Jules Verne. Thank you. It was Jules Verne.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah,
over and
yeah.
over too.
So, but it's kind of fantasy, but you could go someplace and go on a dig and find dinosaur bones. And we are going to Mars, and I'm not sure about time travel. Maybe we'll get there, but that's a whole other story, butterfly effect and everything. So as much as I love fantasy and coming at it from a Catholic perspective, I think a lot of people would look at the stuff we believe and say, that's magic mumbo jumbo. Like, well, we'll talk about that. But the science fiction is, there's a science to this, and who knows until we try what is or isn't possible. You know, I'm learning a lot about propulsion in my job, but like I don't know about how does that relate to the warp drive, like on Star Trek. So I can talk to my coworkers and say, how real is this? How possible is this from what we know now? And there is some possibility of that. What can we do? I'm not going to go pull out a magic wand and go bippity boppity boo on something, but you know, I now have my communicator device. So that's pretty awesome. And just to come at it from the Catholic angle again, so the Catholic Observatory out in, I think, Arizona, the Vatican Observatory, I was doing research there for something, and they said, yeah, I mean, we don't know if aliens exist, but if they do, as Catholics, we're just going to, you know, evangelize to them like we would for anyone. I was like, I love that. I can go out to people and be like, yeah, let's talk. Do aliens exist? And just know that my faith allows for that possibility. But again, from the standpoint of just the love of Christ. And I'm like, well, that's pretty cool. That allows for so much more of that science fiction possibility to actually be true. I actually don't know if I believe in aliens, but it's still fun to think about.
I think that's the cool thing. We're not, you know, threatened or concerned by, you know, by anything. Yeah. Mary, what about you? What are some reasons why you love sci-fi as a genre?
I think for me, it's a lot of, like, obviously the sort of, you know, the not the gimmick, but, you know, like the trademark thing of sci-fi is the technology, right? And the possibilities that new technology gives us in the way we live our lives and things we can do. But what always fascinates me about those kinds of stories is not necessarily the technology itself, but the moral questions that these new possibilities sort of turn up. Because it usually comes down to the question of, you know, oh, here's this new possibility of all these things we can do to the world or to ourselves or to each other. And then, of course, there's a question, well, we can, but should we? And, you know, it's sort of like the newness and these new possibilities and discoveries always kind of point back to, like, the fact that our own nature is actually doesn't change with the centuries. And that we, you know, we're facing the same questions that we ever did, you know, as a race, as humanity, as people, and that these, you know, the new technologies and, you know, powers that it gives us is kind of just another lens of considering that question of what are we and what is our nature, and what's good for us and what's not. So that's what I find. Is, you know, kind of attracts me most. I like the sci-fi stories that kind of get into those, you know, kind of deep moral questions, you know, and really wrestle with them.
Yeah, there's so not all. I like the point you made about the tools, and I'll just extrapolate that to the context as well, right? I think one of the reasons we tell fairy stories or fantasy stories is we want to sort of engage with an idea, or like you said, look into a moral example or a moral living, or what does it mean to be a human, or how should a human respond? But if you take that and you plop it into 21st century America, automatically readers bring in biases and, you know, things that are normal. But if you take that exact same situation and if you're careful not to be too literal about it, and then you just swap out the context, all of a sudden nobody comes with the same preconceptions, and you're free to kind of explore an idea and walk around it and maybe rethink how should a human respond to this situation when you don't have these same biases and habits and cultural expectations in play. And I see a lot of sci-fi is trying to do that. sort of bringing sci-fi a little closer to home, you have not all of it is set in the future or not, other galaxies and so on. Jurassic Park, for example, Michael Crichton, I love him as an author, and the way that he's able to, he'll have fun with sci-fi, and I so wish they would make a time traveling show based on that John he did to the Middle Ages. What, I'm drawing a blank.
Timeline? I think so. That's the only
Timeline,
one of his books
I wish
I've read,
that was
a
series.
A lot. That was wild.
Yeah. His Jurassic Park series and so on, but it is very much about the technology. And if we did have this particular freedom, I mean, you could just sort of look at it and think it's basically a magic wand, that they have. But it's trying to dramatize in a more, real kind of feeling way. What are the limits of human freedom? And then I think I haven't seen this movie, but I've read about it with The Martian, right? Where he's stuck growing potatoes on Mars and stuff. And that really isn't so much, from what I've understood, it's not so much about the moon context and so on. It's more this other frontier of human capability, right? And that kind of creative response to being able to think outside of the norm and look at your environment, and it's an extremely hostile, kind of new environment. I think that's why I loved The War of the Worlds, because I think it's meant to be dramatization of what happens when you are colonized by something, right? Whether you like it or not. And I think I'm curious what you think about this phrase. As we're talking, it just came to me. Sci-fi could be the fantasy of our future, because we can look back and see fantasy as a sci-fi of our past, right? I think a lot of the tropes, when we look at fantasy, they like we said earlier, they were kind of the science fiction ideas from a medieval, sacramental, fantasy-rich, culture, and they were combining them like, this is what reality is like out there, or this is what the future could be like if more angels were in charge of things or more demons were doing stuff and so on. And so when we write fantasy, we feel like we're going back and borrowing things from the past. But when we, as materialist moderns, first world and so on, when we look at the future, these are the fantasy stories that we're telling, maybe because we're not sure anymore that our boundaries are enough or are, clear enough. Curious what comes to your mind as you think about that.
Okay, so the concept you want to really discuss is, as fantasy was kind of the past and science fiction the future, that science fiction could become our past, kind of?
Well, that's an interesting take on it. What I was curious is science fiction is a form of fantasy, because it's borrowing a lot of the same tropes. I mean, you look at Star Trek, for example, and you swap out the context, and what do you have? Dwarves, elves, humans, kind of magical, moving around and just kind of able to do things. But it's that context of that it's based in like the scientific method, or it's meant to be, I don't know. It's kind of a clumsy question.
I kind of get what you're saying. And so my take on that would be, when I was in high school, the short stories that I have written for science fiction were Snow White and the Seven Droids. And it was the classic fairy tale, but instead of dwarves, they were droids. But still a princess, still running away from an evil stepmother, same thing. And then there was Goldilocks and the three space bears, where she's breaking into their ship and using their stasis pods and eating their meals ready to eat rations. So it was the mixing of the two. We have this fantasy setup that's been used again and again and again for different things, but then plugging in the science fiction aspects, and usually those science fiction aspects were space and technology, which you can have science fiction without space, or like looking again at the Lost World, there wasn't really technology there. It was all archaeology. And so Stargate, that's one of the cool things, because you have the mythology, that fantasy, coming into the world of science fiction, the portals. They have ships in Stargate. And then they go to Atlantis too, which is, you know, how often have we heard about Atlantis? Is Atlantis real? Is it fantasy? But now let's make it science fiction. So I think that's kind of one of the key identifiers is like, what's the technology there? But also you don't really need technology for it to be science fiction. And then if you look at the movie Onward, I mean, that's kind of set in like our modern day, and they are fantasy.
You mean like the Pixar?
Yeah, the Pixar movie.
Yeah, okay.
But they're using technology, and that's part of the point is like they're not flying anymore because they're using technology to get around. But I wouldn't consider that science fiction, but I would consider it fantasy with technology. So it just makes the line even more blurry. But I think that's where it's fun, is where it's blurry and you get to mess it around and say, I got to call it what I want.
These genres, there's such a spectrum. Like you try to pin it down, and you can't be dogmatic about these things because they do blend, and that's what we do as creatives. Is we're all about breaking boundaries, and heck, it's a frontier. So it's all about once you found the frontier, now let's find a new one.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Mary, on that front?
I don't know. I think Elizabeth covered it pretty well, but yeah, it is just fun to think about.
Well, that's.
Yeah, all the things that were like sci-fi in the past but are real now. It's a little bit wild. Like I think that's I mean, we've sort of been circling this for the whole conversation, but I think like that's a distinction between sci-fi and fantasy is like, you know, Jules Verne with like his submarines and, you know, moon rockets. Like that's not fiction anymore. Which is, you know, just a little crazy to think about. So
What's that whole thing, isn't it about life imitating art, right? They dreamed or created ideas, and then we went in and actually took them seriously, and but they just imagined it ahead of us. But isn't that so? You know, as we're writing science fiction, what are some tropes that, for example, you can't stand, that people just need to stop doing that, so that as, you know, people watching this or those in our community or getting into writing it and kind of flexing their creativity, what are some toxic tropes maybe, or just things that just grind your gears when you see them done in science fiction that you think they should avoid? Elizabeth, you look like you've got one on mind. Do you want to go?
Yes, I was hoping you'd ask about tropes, and I kind of have like some that are kind of, okay, those irk me, but whatever, and then one I really love, so I'll mention that too. But
cool.
One of the things, again, from a more technology-heavy science fiction is like the sassy robot. Now, I love sassy robots, but let's make them a little bit different. I don't want to be reading some brand new novel and it's basically C-3PO. Like, no, make it a new sassy robot, or this kind of get into it. One of my favorite science fictions is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it's not a sassy robot; it's a very depressed robot, which is kind of funny. Because it's like it took it, and I don't know if it was already a trope then. I mean, I think this was after Star Wars, which is great. So I love that, but I guess I don't like it when they take the same ship, the same technology. Maybe it's like in fantasy, you keep having the same unicorn over and over again. Like, no, change the unicorn, do something different with the unicorn, you know, change the ship, do something different with the robot. So that's a trope that I want to see people push themselves to think of different technologies instead of just copying Star Wars. But then the trope that I love, which doesn't come up very often, but is in Douglas Adams, is space whales and whales in space. Star Trek did it in The Voyage Home. It's my favorite Star Trek movie. Doctor Who had an episode, and that was one where they really looked at like a philosophical question about you'll just have to watch it. I don't know what it's called. And apparently there's one in Star Wars, but I think it was in the novels. So yeah, whales in space, I think, is just a really cool idea. So wherever that comes up, I'm like, I automatically love this. So
I was starting to watch the behind the scenes for Disney's Atlantis: The Lost Empire, and they had something they left on the cutting room floor, which was lava whales.
Oh my gosh.
That was a missed opportunity. Yep. Dangerous sequence where they're trying to get away from great big surging. I don't even know where that could have gone.
No,
cool.
I'm so glad you mentioned Atlantis, because that's like my favorite Disney movie of all time, and like one of my favorite movies ever.
Oh really? I wish they turned that into a show,
Yeah.
like a series.
I mean, I could
that would
rant
be
about
amazing.
that, but I should stay on topic. But yeah, tropes. A trope that gets on my nerves. Let's see. Well, one I was thinking of that I think I'm just, one that I'm maybe particularly sensitive to because I'm like Catholic, is just the portrayal of religion in sci-fi. I think a lot of times it's either, a lot of times they either bash it, like it's, oh, we're the, now we're the modern sort of enlightened people, and anyone who's hanging on to religion is sort of, either dumb or the enemy. Or it's just non-existent. Like, oh, in this future world, like, nobody's religious anymore, of course. And I'm kind of like, well, first of all, that's just not realistic. Just on a, like, basic sort of world-building level. But I think that was, maybe one of the things, or even one of the reasons that it took me a long time to really start reading some of the, like, more popular or more classic sci-fi. Because a lot of it, especially a lot of the classic stuff, did come from that very, like, materialistic, atheistic viewpoint. And it's only, I feel like, more recently that, people have been trying to push that boundary. Like, no, religion is a human question, so it's allowed in sci-fi. Like, so yeah, would
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would.
Yeah.
I would.
I think
love to
I think you're right
more,
about that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, more science fiction where that's sort of portrayed just honestly, and genuinely, and not that all the religious characters have to be good guys or anything. Yeah. Like, it can be complex and realistic, but just have it there because it is there, and it is something that it is a human question.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. I think the author of what is it, Robert Hugh Benson, he wrote Lord of the World as a kind of, it was back in the 1920s or something, and he dramatized what the Antichrist might be like, and then he wrote a follow-up, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was his idea of, like, what would the world be like if Western European Catholic religion did sort of ascend and succeed and become the global culture, and it was full of sort of sacramentalism and kind of magical, Lourdes was a massive touch point for miracles and so on. It was a culture that integrated the miraculous alongside blimps and monorails and stuff. And it's a cool vision. But I like your point about, these things are human questions. And I think that's the key thing about science fiction. No matter, how dramatic you're being, no matter what kind of aliens you're incorporating, it ultimately does come back to what do humans, how do humans react or integrate or respond to or think or just come in contact, with these things. Drawing a blank. There was one, don't think I can remember. It was an older story, but anyway, another story that's just taken the world by storm and it's coming out again this year is Avatar, right? And it's very much that same sense. In a way, I see sci-fi coming full circle in terms of the public consciousness, right? Sci-fi used to be, I think, as you just said, Mary, and I agree with that, it used to be written as the kind of materialist dream of what the future could be like, without the barnacles of religion, just please, So some of them would be dreams about the future. Others would be horror stories about the future or cautionary tales, like what happens when our brain gets away from our heart, what happens when we develop the capacity to keep creating better and better technology and it gets away from us. There's a lot of stories like that. In a way, they're kind of like, cautionary tales. I think that serves a purpose for that. But to your point about, I think do your research about the religion you're engaging with, and as Catholics, I think this same sort of pressure falls on us as well, not only to do our own research into our own religious tradition and not just sort of have fun with the way you grew up, in the faith, but actually get to. This is kind of where being a Catholic author is also an invitation to enter into your own faith life, maybe faster or more seriously than the way a lot of other people might. Because in a way you have to understand it more so that you can dramatize it. You have to you're looking under the hood at how everything else works. Do the same with how our faith works as well. Most of us don't have time to do that. Life is busy. We just learn the ropes, do the checklists, But I think authors are part of that class of people. We need to think a little more seriously about how it works, and then give the same, maybe reverence or the same attention to everything else, and don't flatten, even people you disagree with. And I think that's kind of the mark of a great writer, is more often someone who can understand and maybe empathize with all the different sides. And the human components, the human investment in different aspects. And then we just dress them up as aliens, or we dress them up in, But I think that's the thing that I think is important. If you're trying to write something that's, that feels meaningful, or that matters. Like Avatar is very much, what is the human response? Materialist, modern, scientific, rational human, maybe response, colonialist, to animism or shamanism or a sacramental reality. Do you smash and burn, which is kind of what they end up doing. But some don't. Some kind of take the mystical response of actually engaging with it, learning from it. I imagine a lot of people kind of look at Christianity and look at, Orthodox Catholicism or Christianity, and they're like, you're about as weird as the Navi in how you think about life. And we're like, I'll own it. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love what Chesterton does with, he'll write his own science fiction novels, again, loosely part of that genre. What was it? The Emperor of Notting Hill. Right? I don't know if you ever read that, but it's, pardon me, Napoleon of Notting Hill. Yeah. And it's kind of this idea of, what if we were to take seriously old ideas of love of place and then transpose it into modern day Britain, which was 1890, 1910 at the time, and how this one person's radical love of a place and unwillingness to allow it to be plowed under into new developments, how that shatters and just destroys the pragmatism of local government. It's kind of like he's discovered, like what an Avatar does. I've discovered a deep truth, a binding and beautiful reality, and I'm dressing it up and I'm going to celebrate it and stand by it and die for it. And then the rest of the world just goes nuts. They can't understand this level of, more transcendent thinking, you could say. You could also argue it's more radicalist or fundamentalist maybe, but then that's kind of the point of fiction, is to dramatize, to kind of up the contrast a little bit. So I love sci-fi. It's probably right there next to fantasy, but I think I love it even more than fantasy, because it's very much that imaginative response to our own normal reality. I mean, you this is kind of the funny thing though about it as a genre. You travel anywhere else in the world, like you go to Ethiopia, right? Or you go to Morocco or even India. I doubt that they're going to tell the same stories or be interested in the same questions that we are. It's very much a genre that appeals to first world scientific theory, because they're ideas that we buy into. You go to Ethiopia and they're like, of course there's monsters in the lake. Who are you kidding? This is a real world, Yeah. And well, there's a whole nother discussion. Sacramental worldview is normal for many Indians, Chinese, maybe not modern communist sort of Chinese, but those who are part of that older world tradition that we would sort of lump under fantasy. For them it's deeply real. And for a lot of us Catholics, we're stuck. And that's kind of why this genre intrigues me. We are stuck on that knife edge frontier between sacramental worldview, where we go and receive communion and we invoke angels and we pray to God and we have a creed that transcends time and space and talks about a communion of saints, across multiple lifelines, and time can work backwards too, Speaking about time travel there. So yes, that's real. but then we're also deeply part of building spaceships to go to Mars and the internet and trying to save gas, buying groceries and stuff. So we're like this bridge between these two incredible worlds. And this is the one genre that allows us to kind of, how do we integrate both? And I think, yes, if you want to have fun with it as a genre, go right ahead. But if you're looking to it maybe as a Catholic, what does a Catholic bring to this? It's not, dump it, we need to be Tolkien. No, I think it actually has a really important role that it can play. So wrapping up, do you have any thoughts on that, like in a minute you'd like to share, or closing thoughts to sort of encourage people as they're thinking about writing sci-fi?
I have a thought, but I think it might take more than a minute, so I'll try to keep it brief and maybe we can use it for a future conversation. Talking about science fiction, none of us brought up really superheroes, which I would kind of consider science fiction, but also you have Thor, who's a superhero, but also a god. That's fantasy. But then you look at the saints and bilocating and levitating, and that sounds like a superpower to me. So I think that's a very interesting, there's a knife edge there. We're standing on it. But some of the exploration that has been done into that thing, those characters, those main characters of fantasy, science fiction, superheroes, well, that's kind of looks like our saints, which we do believe to be true, to be real. So I think there's something there also to, I want a Catholic. I'm sure there have been Catholic superhero novels, but I would love to investigate that.
Well, I'm going to throw Daredevil, the new one with Charlie Cox on Marvel.
Yeah.
That counts as sci-fi. I mean, loosely, because it's taking a reality and then just upping the science-y hand-wavium on it. And then it's not really the most important part of him. It's really his like wrestling with his faith and so on. But there's a great example of even somebody being Catholic. And then just wrestling with the modern world, and then you just throw this little element in it to kind of, make it cool.
Yeah.
Good point. Good point. Mary, any closing thoughts?
Maybe just, don't sort of. There's no shame in like loving both the science and the faith. You can go wholeheartedly into both of them. Like they're both gods. So we don't. There aren't sort of questions that we need to shy away from, I guess. And that just, I think, increases the wonder and the joy of the exploration. So just leaning into that.
Yeah. I think wonder is a phenomenal word, and is a good word. And sometimes you can wonder about how things can go wrong as a cautionary tale, and there are plenty of sci-fi stories about that. Or just to wonder about possibilities, how things could be good. That's incredibly important too. Or to wonder just about taking an idea and then just putting it in a new context so that it can feel fresh again, so that you can actually think about it again. And sometimes ideas feel like they become old and stale and trite and boring when they're not, but we are so used to looking at them. And so I think there are some groups that can't stand sci-fi at all. They can't stand the idea of aliens. And I used to hate the idea of aliens just growing up. Now I don't mind them so much. And this is, I think, what Catholics do, is what we're meant to do, is go deeper. Like St. Peter says, challenge everything, right? And then hold fast to what is true. But if you think about all the different kinds of aliens out there, they're in stories and so on, they're serving the same role that we associate with dwarves and elves and kobolds and like these other things. They're like versions of humans. They're versions of how people are, to dramatize what we keep coming back to. We dramatize these ideas of sin and judgment and grace and goodness, but it comes back to that main word, dramatize. We're like up in the ante. We're increasing the contrast. But it does come down to, it's all about people. And if you make a robot your protagonist, it's still about people. There's still a human being or a soul or that idea. Maybe it's Pinocchio and you're just putting gears on it or something. So, alrighty. Yeah, thanks, ladies, so much for coming on today. It was fun to just spend the time and chat. For those who joined us and caught the replay, this conversation is one of the kinds of conversations that we're having in Catholic Author. It's a free community for Catholic authors to come and join us. It's a place where you can give and get feedback. You can share your works in progress, share stuff you're writing on, and join into all the different things that we've got going on. So if you enjoy this kind of conversation, you got questions, come and join us, CatholicAuthor.us. Check us out. We'd love to meet you. Till next time, keep writing.